Iceland, my home, is one of the wealthiest and happiest countries in the world right now. And my own grandmother was born in a house made of turf and stone, with a dirt floor, no electricity, and no running water, not 100 years before her. That gap is smaller than most people assume when they picture how a country gets from one to the other. And honestly, it is smaller than I fully understood myself, until I actually sat down and asked her about it properly. For most of Icelandic history, there was almost no timber here to build with. This island never really had forests worth using, so for centuries people built with what was actually available, stacked stone and turf cut straight from the ground, layered thick enough to hold in heat through winters that gave almost no daylight at all. It was not primitive by accident. It was the only material logic that made sense on a treeless island in the North Atlantic, and it worked well enough that people kept building that way for close to 1,000 years. What surprises people most is not that turf houses existed, it is how recently they were still completely normal. This was not some medieval relic. Whole villages were still living in turf homes into the 1920s and 1930s, and in some rural pockets, into the 1940s. My grandmother was one of the last generation raised inside one, and she is not remotely old enough for that to feel like ancient history to me. It feels like one conversation away. It helps to picture what these homes actually looked like from the outside, because most people imagine something closer to a hole in a hillside than an actual house. They were not that. Turf houses had proper timber door frames imported at real cost, small glass windows where the family could afford them, and a cluster of connecting rooms rather than one single space, each one built up from stacked stone at the base with thick turf laid over a wooden frame above it. From a distance, in summer, the grass roofs made entire farms nearly disappear into the hillside around them, which visitors even at the time described as strange and almost beautiful, in a way locals never really thought to notice themselves. The inside told a different story than the outside did. Ceilings were low enough that a grown man often had to duck through doorways. Multiple generations slept in the same room, sometimes the same bed, both for warmth and because there was rarely space for anything else. Livestock were frequently housed just on the other side of a shared wall, close enough that their body heat helped keep the family's living space bearable through the coldest stretches of winter. It was an entire ecosystem of survival, packed into a few small rooms, and every part of it existed for a practical reason, not out of neglect. Quick stop here. My name is Freyja, and as you might have heard, I grew up in Iceland, and my goal is to share our fascinating story with more people. If you could subscribe, it would help the channel out a bunch. Thanks, and on with the video. She has described it to me more than once, and it is never really about hardship when she tells it. One dim room, sometimes two, an entire extended family under a single low turf roof, the smell of peat smoke, ice sometimes forming on the inside of the walls by morning in the coldest months. Children shared beds, worked from an early age, and nobody thought of any of it as deprivation, because it was simply what everyone around them was doing too. There was no comparison point that made it feel unusual. What actually ended it was not really a single decision, but a slow collision of things arriving all at once, later than almost anywhere else in Europe. Fishing exports finally started generating real income in the early 20th century. Independence from Denmark in 1944 brought a wave of national investment into infrastructure that had simply never existed before. Concrete became affordable and available at scale for the first time. Put together, an entire country essentially rebuilt its housing stock within about 2 generations, which is an almost absurdly short window for that kind of shift to happen anywhere. Then, within the span of a single lifetime, all of it changed. Electricity reached rural Iceland gradually through the middle of the 20th century. Concrete replaced turf as the standard building material almost entirely within a generation or two. My grandmother went from a dirt floor as a child to, decades later, watching this country get ranked among the wealthiest and happiest on the planet. She lived through the entire distance in one lifetime, which is not really how that kind of transformation usually works anywhere else. I think that speed left a mark on how people here relate to comfort, even now, generations later. There is not much appetite for visible extravagance in Iceland. Not much interest in showing off wealth the way you see in plenty of other rich countries. I think part of that comes from being close enough, still, to a version of this country where none of it was guaranteed, close enough that a warm house and a full pantry still register as genuinely worth being grateful for, rather than just the baseline you were born into. It also changes how I think about complaints, honestly, my own included. It is easy to feel inconvenienced by small things, a slow internet connection, a delayed flight, the kind of frustrations that feel enormous in the moment and mean absolutely nothing a week later. Then I think about my grandmother sharing one small room with 6 other people and calling it simply how life was, and it recalibrates something. Not in a way that erases the frustration entirely, but enough to notice how much of what feels urgent now would have sounded almost unimaginably comfortable to someone living here 100 years earlier. I do not think the point of any of this is to romanticize how hard it was, and I want to be careful not to do that. Infant mortality was high. Winters killed people who simply could not stay warm enough. Nobody who actually lived through it, including my grandmother, describes it with any real longing to go back. What I find worth holding on to is not the hardship itself, but how quickly a place can move past it without losing all memory of where it started, and what it might mean to still carry a little of that memory forward on purpose, rather than letting comfort erase it completely within a generation or two. My grandmother still turns lights off obsessively, still finds a use for almost everything before throwing it away. Habits from a childhood where nothing could be wasted because there was rarely anything extra to waste. I used to find it a little funny as a kid. I do not anymore. It is one of the clearest threads I can actually trace. In my own family, in one lifetime, between how hard things were and how carefully my country still tends to treat what it has now. A handful of turf farms have been preserved now, kept standing deliberately so people do not lose the physical memory of what this actually looked like, and a few are open for visitors to walk through. I brought my grandmother back to one a few years ago, the closest thing left to the home she actually grew up in. She did not treat it like a museum. She pointed things out matter-of-factly, where the fire would have been, where the animals were kept, small practical details rather than anything sentimental, and I remember thinking that the ordinariness in her voice said more than nostalgia ever could have.